Good morning, we unicorns, and welcome to our assembly. As you can see, I'm in school and we've been working really hard this week, making sure that our classrooms are set up so that you can be safe and have a bit more distance between you. And we've also been cleaning and cleaning and cleaning. So I have to say, all of the staff have been doing an amazing job this week, clearing out stuff we maybe don't need right now, and making everything safe for August. Today's assembly, I think, is really important. It's a primary 5 to 7 assembly because some of the things in here today are maybe harder to think about. And we'll be doing something a wee bit different with the younger children, but we'll also be asking them to think about some of the same ideas, but just in a way that they can understand. Some of you will have seen lots of stuff on television news and on social media about Black Lives Matter. And so today's assembly is a really important message from me to you, and it also tackles some of the things you've been asking me about. You may have seen pictures like this. Lots of people around the world have been protesting, demonstrating. So what's it all about? Well, a man called George Floyd died when he was in police custody in the United States of America. And a video that somebody took showed a white police officer kneeling on his neck for almost 9 minutes. Many people around the world are protesting because they want racism to stop. So today I want to think about racism. We've had lots of assemblies and lots of lessons about this in the past, but I think it's just a really good time to think about this again because of everything that's going on right now in the world. Childline says that racism is when someone thinks you're inferior because of your colour, your ethnicity, your nationality, or your race. And this can result in them treating you differently or unfairly, and that's called racial discrimination. And racial bullying is a type of racism where someone's bullying focuses on your race, your ethnicity, your culture, or your nationality. Racism and racial bullying are wrong, and you can always get help to make it stop. So what kind of behaviour would count as racism and racist bullying? Well, it might be if somebody calls you a name or sends you an insulting message. You might have your belongings damaged or see racist graffiti written down somewhere. It might be a personal attack, including violence. It might be that you're left out or treated differently. It might be that people just make assumptions about who you are because of your colour, race, nationality, or culture. It might be that you're made to feel like you have to change how you look. It might be a racist joke about your colour, nationality, race, or culture. And racism can affect anybody. It can make you feel like you're not important or you don't fit in, and it might really upset you or make you feel down or angry. And you could even be affected by racism when it's not aimed at you. You might see racism as a bystander, as somebody who's looking on, and that can make you feel really bad too. So what can we do? Well, it's really important to think about this. The racism might be targeted at you, but you also might be a bystander. You might see somebody else being the victim of racism. So it's really important that both kinds of people do something about it, not just the person who has the racial abuse directed at them, but also the people who see it from the sidelines, if you like, from being a bystander. So you can tell an adult, you can speak to a friend and ask them to help you tell. You can walk away to keep safe and don't retaliate or respond because that might make it dangerous for you. You can tell the police on 999 if it's an emergency, or you can tell the police on 101 if it's not an emergency. You can call Childline on 0800 1111, and these are all free telephone calls. And you can keep telling. Sometimes when you tell an adult about racism or racial bullying, it doesn't help, things don't change. So keep telling, go to a different adult and tell them if you feel that it hasn't helped. You can speak to your deputy head teacher in school, to Mrs. Goddard, Mrs. Chamberlain, Mr. Hutchison, and you can speak to me as your head teacher too. It's really important though that you tell a trusted adult or ask a friend to help you tell a trusted adult. So where does racism come from? That's a really complicated question. And as you get older, you'll learn a lot more about this in primary school and in high school. So we can't cover the whole of that question here, but a long time ago, some people believed that people of different colour were of more or less value. So if you look at this picture as an example, this is from an old book, and the book is saying that people of different colour, or who originate from different parts of the world, are not equal. And we don't believe that nowadays, or most people don't believe that nowadays. But this view was used to justify things like slavery and countries taking over other countries and having colonies and empires. And some countries, like the modern United Kingdom, they took over other countries and people in the past. And these colonies or empires made some countries very rich, like the United Kingdom. One of the worst examples of this kind of thinking is something called chattel slavery. And chattel slavery is when one person believed that they had the right to own another person, to own them outright, just the same as they would own a thing, an object. So as well as chattel slavery in the past, we also need to remember that we have modern slavery, which is a different thing, but still exists today. So did this kind of racist thinking and slavery happen in Scotland? Some of you have been asking me about that, and the answer is yes, it did. So you can see this map, and you will have seen this before. We sometimes call this triangular trade because of the shape in the middle. And it's when things that were made in Scotland were taken to the continent of Africa, to countries in Africa. And when the ships got there and offloaded all the things that were made in Scotland, like guns or copper or whatever it was, the ships would then take on slaves who had been kidnapped or stolen from their communities. And then the slaves were taken across to countries in the Caribbean and in North America, where they were used to work on farms to grow things that were then taken back to Scotland. So the slave trade definitely happened in Scotland, and we're going to look at that in a bit more detail. So did it happen in Edinburgh? Absolutely. Edinburgh, if you look at some of the big, rich buildings in Edinburgh, the money that paid for those buildings came from the slave trade and connected to the slave trade. One Edinburgh ship, which was called the Glasgow, set out from Leith for Gambia in the continent of Africa, and it also reached Barbados. And Archibald Dalziel, who was born in Edinburgh, in a part of Edinburgh called Gladstone, was a slave trader. And he was quite a powerful man, and he was from Edinburgh. And there were many powerful men in Edinburgh who were part of the slave trade. Some Edinburgh people, men, were not involved in the triangular trade, but were involved in direct trade. So that meant that they didn't send ships to Africa and then across to the Americas and then back to Scotland, but they just traded directly with Scotland. And that might be things like tobacco, for example. So lots of tobacco plantations, tobacco farms in parts of North America traded directly with Edinburgh merchants. Things that left Scotland were things like wool, coal, metals, things made of metals. And what came back to Scotland from North America were things like rum, sugar, cotton, rice, mahogany wood, and sago, which is a kind of powdered food. And those things were usually farmed by slaves, and it was a pretty horrendous trade. Some of you have been asking about the man who set up our school, or who left money to set up our school. Was he connected to slavery? So James Gillespie was a very well-known tobacconist in Edinburgh. He sold tobacco, and he sold tobacco that came from Virginia, which is a part of North America, and it's a part of North America where there were huge tobacco farms, and lots of slaves were forced to work on those farms. So I don't think James Gillespie was a slave owner, but he was certainly trading tobacco, selling tobacco that came from tobacco plantations. And I know that some people don't like to think about that and don't like to think about that connection that our city and our country and even our school might have with the slave trade. But we do have to think about it, and we do have to acknowledge that it happened, and then we do have to think about what it means for us and what we are thinking about that. There were lots of other famous people in Edinburgh who were connected to the slave trade. William Alexander was the Lord Provost of Edinburgh at one point, so one of the men in charge of the city, and he used to run a ship as part of the slave trade. And John Gladstone was an Edinburgh man. He was the father of one of the prime ministers of Britain, of Great Britain, and he was born in Leith, and he was also involved in making huge amounts of money from the slave trade and plantations in Jamaica. Some of the early history of black people coming to Edinburgh are very much about the slave trade. At one time in Edinburgh, rich people would bring slaves, black slaves, to their homes, and it was a way of showing off how wealthy they were. And this advert that you can see on the screen is particularly horrendous. It's an advert from the Edinburgh Evening newspaper in the 1700s, and it's explaining that there is a black boy who is available to be sold. So obviously, one rich person is selling their slave and has advertised this in the newspaper, which is just unthinkable nowadays, but this is the kind of thing that happened in our city. So it's not all bad news. There were lots of people, even back then, who thought that the slave trade was wrong and that it needed to stop. And you can maybe pause this slide and have a look at the dates and some of the things that were going on in our city and in our country to try and stop the slave trade. You might know that there's a street near our school called Brougham Street, and Henry Brougham and some of his friends were some of the early campaigners to try and stop slavery and make it illegal in Scotland and in Britain. And today we are definitely asking ourselves lots of questions. You might have seen in Bristol in England that a statue of a slave trader was pulled down recently. And we have statues in Edinburgh too, and street names in Edinburgh too, that remember slave traders or people who were involved in the slave trade. And this statue is an interesting one. This is on St Andrew's Square in Edinburgh city centre. Some of you will know it. It's a statue of Henry Dundas, who was an Edinburgh-born MP in the 1700s. And he was involved in convincing MPs not to ban slavery and make it illegal straight away, but to phase it out over a number of years. And some people feel that that was a really bad thing to do because it meant that there were still slaves for a lot longer. So our city leaders have recently decided that they are going to put a new sign on the bottom of the statue to explain all of that and to make it clear what happened. There's a bit more information here about Henry Brougham, one of the early Edinburgh campaigners against slavery, and you can pause the slide and read that and have a look at the plaque that's on the building in Edinburgh where he was associated with. And this man here, Oloda Equiano, was a very interesting man. He was an ex-slave. He had stopped being a slave and he lived in London, and he was heavily involved in supporting all of the activists at the time who were trying to ban slavery. And he heard that there was going to be a debate in the Church of Scotland building in Edinburgh in 1792, and he offered his support to the people who were trying in that debate to have slavery banned. It took quite a long time, and if you think about it, it's not that long ago that slavery was eventually abolished. And it was only in the 1860s that it was made illegal in the United States. So it's not that long ago. It's only a few generations ago, which is quite difficult to come to terms with. This woman, Eliza Wickham, was an Edinburgh woman and very interesting woman. She was one of the 6 key women in Britain who fought against slavery. Her family were at the centre of the anti-slavery campaign in Edinburgh, and her father, John, was a leader of the Edinburgh Anti-Slavery Society, which was a group of people, an organisation that fought against slavery. She raised money and gave that money to a very famous woman called Harriet Tubman, who helped lots of North American slaves escape to Canada um, on a special journey through America and Canada, and which was called the Underground Railroad. It was just the name of the escape route. And some of you might have seen this monument too. This is a monument called the Lincoln Monument. I think it was the first monument in Europe to celebrate the American Civil War leading to the freeing of slaves. And you can see that the statue has a slave and Abraham Lincoln, who became an American president, at the top there. And this is a statue in Edinburgh at the old Carlton burial ground on Carlton Hill. So that we've changed, and our school values today teach us to show connection, a can-do attitude, curiosity, and kindness and respect. And we've been working really hard on these values recently, haven't we? But what can we do to show that we unicorns stand against racism? Well, to stay connected with each other, we could have more days where we teach each other about our family cultures and family histories and family identities. We could have probably more of a can-do attitude about racism and racist bullying. We could try and really believe that we can get rid of this in our school and our city and our country. We can show curiosity about other people's identities, cultures, family histories, and maybe hold more events in school where we find out more about our friends and where their families originated from and what it means to be Black or Asian or Scottish or whatever it is that we identify as. And we can certainly show kindness and respect to everyone, regardless of their nationality, their race, their religion, the colour of their skin. Some of you have been asking, can we have a proper look now at our school? Do our books show stories from many cultures? Do our books show pictures and photographs of people who have different colour, who have different histories, who have different identities? Do we listen to music from a range of different cultures? Do we look at art from a range of different cultures? Do we think about Black people in science and history? Do we hold enough events to celebrate our different identities and our similarities too? Are our assemblies multicultural enough? We have some assemblies that look at different religions, but do we celebrate our identities enough? In school, are Black and ethnic minority people visible enough? Do we have enough visitors who come from different backgrounds than just white backgrounds? And do we make sure that children and staff have enough training and know what to do if they see a hate crime, for example, or racist bullying? And these are all really important questions, and I think the answer we probably know already. We probably can do more in all of these areas. So we've already started to look at buying books, for example, for our library that represent more of the cultures and nationalities and origins and identities of families who come to our school. And I think when we come back to school, I really want us to try and think about having more opportunity, more days in the year where we celebrate our identities and learn about our identities. So I hope this is a beginning. Some of the stuff in today's assembly is probably quite hard to think about because we don't like to think that racism today or things like slavery in the past happened in our city or in our country, or that we even have connections with it all in our school. But I think it's really important that we get this out into the open and we start to talk about it and come to terms with it and see what we can do to change racism today and get rid of racism today. So I look forward to you all coming back in August. I think this is a great conversation that we're going to have, and we can really focus on this in our school. Take care. I hope you have a great weekend. We haven't had any music or songs today in the assembly, but hopefully you can go back over the slides and maybe read some of the more detailed information when you have more time. Thank you very much for listening.